Hey, I am here with Tomas Trajan today, and we're gonna talk about NgRx best practices. How are you, Thomas?
Hey, Christian, thank you for having me. Happy to be here. Yeah, I'm looking forward to explore like some advanced NgRx topics, like in terms of best practices and whatever comes up. Definitely.
Awesome. Do you want to do a quick introduction about
Right.
yourself?
Sure. So, hey folks, my name is Tomas Trajan. I am a Google developer expert for Angular and web technologies, currently working as a consultant and Angular trainer in Switzerland, helping enterprises and other organizations being successful with Angular. If you want to connect, then do not hesitate at Tomas Trajan on Twitter or angularexperts.io on the web. Drop us a message and see if we can help you with your Angular projects.
Nice. So, Thomas, you recently wrote a blog post called "Level Up Your NgRx Skills with 10 Time-Tested Best Practices." So, in this episode, we're gonna go through these 10 best practices, and maybe we can talk about some other NgRx best practices along the way. So, what are the first one?
Sounds great. So maybe like a very little background about that. So like what kind of allows us to speak about like some best practices, right? Because like it's a complex topic. So I mean, of course, it's always about like a non-trivial Angular projects with like multiple features, pages, whatever, and also in like a non-trivial environments like enterprise where you have not just the application itself, because it's very common that like a company works on 1 to 2 applications, but also then in a world where you have a more complex environment with multiple libraries which use libraries which are then used in like more than 100 of consumers. So I think this is the kind of experience which then kind of helps you to uncover some things which work better and something which work less good in this kind of scenarios. But yeah, first what we can start with is like to use the NgRx schematics. So I guess like all the folks which are listening to us are aware of Angular schematics, which allow us to generate some code in Angular projects. So from simple stuff like components or services, all the way in the with relation to the NgRx, like the whole state feature. And this is something which I would really recommend, especially if it's like a larger environment. So not just like one team, where it's very easy to communicate like the patterns and best practices, but if it's like multiple projects, multiple teams, tens of developers, then having some sort of standardization and repeated pattern, I think it's like of great value because it allows people to switch from one project to another, always feel like at home from the initial point, right? And here comes the schematics. So the NgRx allows us to generate stuff like reducer, actions files, selectors files, but also the whole state feature. So basically what you can do is to install NgRx/schematics, and then you can either set it as your default collection because it re-exports all the standard Angular stuff like components and services, or you can call it explicitly, so with ngg or generate, right, at NgRx/schematics, then colon, and the name of the schematic is the actual feature. So literally it's called feature. And then you, of course, have to provide the path to where you want to generate that. And once you run this, it will basically create the state folder, well, however you name it, but I usually call it like state. And then inside of that, you will get the action file, selector file, reducer, effect files with perfectly wired up like boilerplate to set it up with the name of the entity, following almost all the latest best practices out of the box. Plus, it will already also integrate it to like the nearest Angular module to which this state slice should belong. Of course, you can also override it by providing like the module flag when you are calling these schematics in your CLI. So, and I think this is extremely valuable because if your application grows, you usually have more than one state slice, right? You are managing multiple entities. You can also have like a purely view state slices for some flows and stuff like that. So you want to be able to generate those like very fast in a way where they are always the same, always following the same patterns, always integrated exactly the same way. So it's very easy to mix and match it, or also refactor like later down the line when you realize, okay, this state slice started here, but then I realized actually maybe I need to reuse it like in multiple features. So maybe I have to extract it to core and something like that. And if you do it this way, then moving it around or even just generating two in place of one becomes much less effort compared to a situation where everybody would write it slightly differently using their own preferred way or style, right? So this is something which I really think like pays off to do in like any non-trivial project. Yeah.
I remember, Thomas, when we met the first time, it was when we both were living in Zurich. You were doing this talk about custom schematics.
Right. Yeah.
Is that also something you normally do for project like build like NgRx custom schematics, or you just follow the default ones coming from the NgRx
so no, usually I go with the default ones. That's again like over the years I came to value the standardization the most, and especially because of the large enterprise environment where I'm usually like acting. So then the highest value I put on is on the standardization and uniformity. So for example, like a contra example to schematics is that NgRx now introduced new factory function which reduces boilerplate even a little bit further, which is called like create feature. So before you had like create action, create reducer, create effect, and now you even have like a create feature which reduces boilerplate slightly even more, right? Now the problem with that is that currently out of the box schematics do not use it yet. So I would still be, in my personal subjective view, I would be still in favor of using the schematics which are available out of the box, because that way the most people would be on the same page. So this goes to that, could we write like a custom one which will do it with the create feature? Yes, but most likely it is better just to wait to get like the official one so that everybody is on the same page. Also, maybe what could happen is that once there are official ones, they may, we don't know, but maybe it can happen that they will provide some official migration script. So if you followed the old patterns, maybe you will get a new pattern for free, which does happen, right? Because sometimes ng update, whenever those libraries have their own schematics, they can have an update schematic which comes with some out of the box migration scripts, which happened in the past for stuff like when you import like Angular material to adjust the imports, or like in view child to set the static property and stuff like that. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we may get something like this also for NgRx, as long as we follow the official route when they choose to switch the out of the box schematics to use create feature instead of create reducer action, and so on and so on. So yeah, I am more biased towards not doing custom stuff. Of course, the contra example to that can be if you are doing 2-3 projects with your high velocity team, and you are just like not so many people, and it's easy to coordinate, and you can create something which helps you to be even faster, then of course go for it, right? So there is never like a single answer which can suit every situation and like every circumstance.
Yeah, I agree with Angular in general, the standardized way, which get the very opinionated way of doing stuff. It's beneficial if you can, and most of the time, like more than 90% of the time, that should be good enough for most use cases.
Exactly. I mean, it is a slight, let's say in that specific example of this whole state feature schematics, like it is slightly more boilerplate if it doesn't use the newest create feature factory function, but again, it was generated for you. So from your point of view, there is no boilerplate, right? Like you didn't have to create those files, you didn't have to do the wiring. So there is boilerplate, but you do not feel any pain of that boilerplate. It just works, and you can jump directly to writing your own actions, effects, and selectors, right? So there is no pain.
Right.
So I think that's also maybe something which we can point out, that like one of the like things which people sometimes say like against the NgRx, that there is still some boilerplate. Like once you are not writing in where is the pain, then you only have this benefit of it being all very explicit, not much magic. That way you are in full control, and it's very easy to understand what is going on, right?
Right.
What about you? Like, did you use the like NgRx feature schematics to create whole feature state slices in your project recently, or?
Yeah, I usually do that as well. Yeah, why not? Yeah, we usually do it the same way. I do either that, or I do there's these VS Code snippets where I get generated. Sometimes I'll just do that, but yeah, schematics,
in the end is like the same outcome, right? Like you have just
yeah, right.
predictable output where it's like you can just focus on implementing the actual features and not on the ceremony around, but still can be cool to have that ceremony in case you need to change something. So
Yeah.
it's like a best of both worlds, but let's see how it evolves.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And I think we can jump to the second one.
Sure. So yeah, this one is not even like maybe best practice in itself, but it's more something like which I did not really see acknowledged too much online. So basically the point goes, recognize and leverage the NgRx 80-20 rule, which is a little bit like clickbaity catchy, but I still think it's true. So what it means is that if you think about NgRx, it's like a Redux pattern state management library for Angular. So it's used in Angular applications, right? The Angular is famous for its like robustness on that like engineering level. You have dependency injection, you have like modules and stuff like that, right? And also Angular is pretty famous of using RxJS for many of its APIs. So you have to work with observable streams, which are very powerful, of course, but are also complex and people often get it wrong. It's like a topic which takes a while to master. I think everybody would agree that it took a while to like learn this properly. Now, if we think about NgRx, what are like the 5 main concepts or like 5 main like entity types in NgRx, let's just say? So we have the store, right, where we store everything. And then we have selectors to retrieve the state from the store, maybe calculate derived state. Then we have actions to basically notify the NgRx that there was some user action or some event in our application which should update the state in the store. Then we have the reducers, which are supposed to perform that updating of the state in the store. And then we have effects which perform any kind of side effects. And now if you think about it, we have 5 things, right? So then the 80% are 4 things. So if you think the store, actions, reducers, and selectors, if you look closer at them, they don't know anything or are totally decoupled from the Angular and RxJS stream. So even though the whole NgRx runs as an NgRx stream, right? Like it's this kind of like a loop, one-way data flow. Whenever you are writing your own logic, the implementation of the actions, of the reducers, of the selectors, those are just pure JavaScript or let's say TypeScript functions, right? And there is no simple concept in like front-end engineering as a function. Function is like the simplest thing there is. You just call your function with some arguments and you get some result, right? So this has some implications also, for example, for testing. Whenever you want to test your plain function logic, it's the most simplest thing. You just call your function and you got some result, and the result is either correct or wrong, right? So there is no test bed. There is no Angular context. There is no building of a context with the correct modules or anything like that. There is no dependency injection. There is no overriding of providers. There is nothing like that, just plain pure function. So if you think about it like philosophically, there is no really difference between the reducer and a function multiply A times B. In the end, it's the same thing, right? So I think that's really like a genius of the API design, and especially of the library, to take something which is relatively complex and then cut it in such a way that you have these nicely, clearly separated concerns, which only focus on that one part and they are not mixed and matched. So you have like, you can only focus on one thing. And then to take it even step further and to implement these concepts in the simplest possible way that it's possible in the engineering, like with the plain function, even though behind the scenes, it all runs as RxJS stream and triggers the change detection and all these kind of things, right? So I think this is really, really amazing. So, and this basically leaves us with effects. So the effects are actual Angular services. That means we are doing some dependency injection. Most likely we are injecting some services, which then perform that side effects. Also, every effect starts with some RxJS stream. Usually it's a stream of actions, but it can be actually any kind of stream. It can be stream of scroll events if you want to perform something when you scroll to the bottom of your page, right? It can be literally anything, any kind of stream. So then you could argue that the effects are the only, this 20%, which are bit more complicated. But if you think about it, they are as complicated as a standard Angular services because they are not doing much more than that. But then the cool thing about the effect is that it's, again, very structured. So it's very common to, when we are writing effects, that we split effect into like 5 smaller effects, and then each previous effect triggers the next one with a success action whenever it was finished. You do not have to manage subscription state, right? The NgRx lifecycle subscribes the effect for you once it's instantiated, for example, when you navigate to your lazy feature. And again, you can, like the pattern allows you to chunk it into very small pieces which are easy to understand and evolve and to maintain and to digest. And then the only point through which they touch are like those actions, those events which trigger one another. So it's relatively easy to follow what's going on, right? So I think
I think that's good explanation for people that are new to NgRx, to demystify, the whole thing, because I guess it's quite overwhelming when you start with the framework. It's like learning something like Angular again. You just finished learning Angular, then you learn some RxJS. That was confusing enough, and then NgRx on top, and then like, oh, what all these like 3 big frameworks I just had to learn, it acts as a nice abstraction over some of the RxJS stuff you will have to do yourself. For example, the implicit subscription you get in the effects, you don't need to worry about subscribe, unsubscribe, all this stuff. If you just keep it in the effect, that will take care of that. So yeah, definitely, like, demystify a lot of the scariness that can come initially when you're working with NgRx. When you think of it like that, it just functions,
And another thing maybe which we can mention is like, so like it's common if you don't use any kind of state management solution in your application, then your logic will be spread across like the services and components, right? And components in general are like the hardest thing to test because you have to build like the context. There is a test bed with all the stuff where you can use custom schema, whatever, but it takes the longest, is the most complicated to test. Like there you have to trigger change detection manually, stuff like that. But now, like with the NgRx, you are supposed to, and it's like allowed by NgRx and is encouraged by NgRx to move most of your logic into selectors, into reducers, into effects, right? So then you will end up in practical purposes like with container components which have no logic whatsoever. So they just get the state from the selector and they just emit actions based on user interaction. So you would even argue that you do not actually need to test them. The only thing you could test is like, did I render the correct view based on the state? Or did I dispatch the correct action if user clicked on a button? I mean, you could still test that, but those tests are of relatively low value because that's not the real logic, right? So that's like that Angular called the click handler, that's the Angular, that's not our application, right? So we are basically moving all this logic, or most of this logic, into pure functions, which are easy to test. So this also can then lead to situation when you have better test coverage where the real logic actually resides, right? So I think that's another like benefit of that 80-20, that you can reduce the amount of implementation in the Angular part, which is hard to test.
Right. Should we go to number 3?
Yes. So when in doubt, pull your logic one level up to preserve nice, clean one-way dependency graph. So here we probably need to take a little bit of like side turn to build some context first, and then we can dive deep into the point itself. So basically this is very related to like a general architecture of the Angular application. So usually I recommend, whenever working with Angular application, to basically implement every single feature as a lazy loaded feature. And that starts also from like, if you only have a one page, for example. So usually your Angular application has 2 parts, right? The eager part, which is there from the start, and then the lazy features, which usually are triggered as a result of navigation. That way you get a smaller bundle size, let's just say, faster rebuilds during development, which you may argue if it's really necessary. But the very huge benefit of that approach is to, whenever you split your logic into independent lazy features, then those lazy features cannot really import from each other. So you have kind of like guaranteed isolation, which is really cool because then whenever you change something in one feature, you know you could not have broken anything else in other features, right? So that you have kind of like a three great benefits: faster startup time for the user, faster rebuild times for you as a developer during the development, right? Which you only rebuild that feature which you are working on, not the whole thing every time. But this one, which is not obvious, maybe like on the first look, is that those lazy features are not basically allowed to import from each other, because if you did that, you either like break that laziness, so it will all end up in main bundle, which can be then basically caught with budgets that your main bundle ballooned suddenly because of the bad import, or if it doesn't, if it's not code like this, and if it doesn't end up in main bundle, what can also happen is you will get runtime errors where basically you try to use something which is not there yet, and it's not there yet because it depends on the order of navigation. So if user first goes to like feature A and then to B, then it works. But if user goes first to feature B and the feature B wants something from feature A, which is not there, it will fail, right? So you have this isolation, so that's very cool. And then once you follow that, this will also have impact on your NgRx logic, of course, on your state slices, because you will have state slices which has to be there from start in the eager part of your application. So that can be something like authentication state, user state, or whatever have you, something which you know you need in multiple parts of your application, or something which you need from start. But then it's also pretty typical to have state slices which are only initialized once you navigate to some feature, because only that feature needs that part of the state. So why would you manage it like from start, right? So, and then the common thing which happens, now we are getting to the point itself. So the common thing which tends to happen over time as you develop your application is that you start like in a isolated state slice in your isolated lazy feature, but then you realize that maybe you need to reuse part of that state or even the whole state in a sibling lazy feature, which is isolated at the moment. So, and then comes this pull your logic one level up. So let's say I have feature A and feature B. So I navigate to feature A, I navigate to feature B. But then I realize I need that state from feature B, I also need in feature A. So now to pull it one level up, I will literally move that folder, that state folder, maybe it has a name like state user or state order or whatever. I would literally move it into the core, which is usually like a how do you say, convention to name, like at least I name that folder which is there in the eager part, which has this kind of logic. So I will literally move that folder which has that state slice into the core. And of course, if it's in core, it's available for the whole application. So you can use it in feature A, in feature B. That way you can, for example, access the selector to reuse that state in both features, right? Now, what would happen if I need only part of that feature B state and not the whole thing? Then maybe I would not move the whole thing, but what I can do is, again, use schematics, generate a new state slice in a core, and just copy part of the properties from that state slice in the lazy feature B in the core, of course, or not copy, move, right? I don't want it duplicated. And basically split the actions which belong to core and action selectors and reducer functions which belong to the core part of that state slice and the one which can stay in that lazy feature. And this is something which is like, I mean, it's a refactoring, but it's relatively painless to do in practice when this kind of architecture is followed, which I have like from hands-on experience. So that's like a one level up, right? If we are in the first level of navigation, the first level of lazy loaded modules, then one level up would be the eager part of the application, customary called like core. Let's say if you have a multi-level navigation, like you have a feature A and then you have sub feature A1 and sub feature A2, again, they can have their own state slices. And again, if I need to reuse part of it in both, one level up. What is one level up in this case? The feature A. And if I really need to reuse it even more, than all the way to core, but usually just like one level up. So do you have experience with this kind of approach? Like, or
Yeah,
what about this
yeah,
kind of architecture?
yeah, especially if you follow the principle of no data duplication, and everything should be, and you use something like NgRx entity, and you do like normalization of all the data, then this is very important. As soon as something, is it has to be shared between, then you don't want to implement some kind of synchronization logic to sync between two feature modules. Instead, move it one level up and like keep one single source of truth, because that's going to save you in the long run from a lot of like nasty synchronization problems. If you duplicate it, and of course, yeah, you cannot link. You cannot reference across feature modules as well. That will also break the lazy loading. So yeah, this is really the only way if you want like less headache.
Yeah, that's a very good point you made there. Like we never want to really duplicate the state. So we have these state slices, right, which take care of some part of the state usually, but there is only one single global store. And of course you can have like basically if you had like a users or like order state, like all list of all the orders, right? And you could have in theory two state slices which manage exactly the same entity from backend, but exactly then you can come to situation when those two state slices are out of sync, because on one page you perform something, maybe you close some order or execute it or set it to another state, then you navigate back, but you didn't reload it or something like that, then you will see inconsistent data at like best. At worst, if you don't have like a properly implemented checks in the backend, you may end up also with inconsistent state in the backend, which I mean, this should never happen, because of course you should not never really depend on the front-end logic to like validate your business model, of course, just like if for whatever reason that would be the case, that it can be even worse. So yeah, definitely that's a very, very related point. So yeah, whenever in doubt, pull your logic one level up.
Mm-hmm. And you especially see it like if you follow like a big, I've been working on, for example, big monorepo setups for like 50 developers working together on a big NX monorepo with like multiple layers and stuff. So you really see like how you like keep following that pattern of moving like step one level up. It can be like, you know, many levels in the architecture that can consist of many subdomains. So yeah, this can really like scale up this principle. There can be many levels. Just
that's a very good point you brought here also. Like, let's mention also NX, like also with relation to that architecture. So whenever we just work like in a plain Angular CLI repository, then like I still try to like spread that architecture that we have eager core and then we have these lazy features. And I try to catch like the imports which violate this architecture with the very tight budgets, but this is not perfect, right? So NX pushes it to a next level where we can basically define tags and the rules who can import who, and we can prevent this from occurring. So we can like tag that this is a lazy feature or however you want to call it, or just feature or page or whatever you want to call it. And then you can define a simple rule in an ESLint RC that you can never import from one feature in another feature. So then you don't just depend like, okay, my bundle budget is like tied to 3 kilobytes, which can be annoying because then you have to bump it all the time just to make sure. But then you have like an explicit rule to only take care of that part. So that's another thing which we are also exploring, like to come up with some standardized approach, like a finite language to implement Angular application using NX even from a single application, because this kind of like this can be beneficial already.
I think it actually makes sense just if you have one application to follow the NX domain driven architecture. I think it actually can make sense, even though it's built, of course, for supporting multiple apps. It's
just
still
because it allows you
benefit,
to validate your architecture.
Yeah, you can write ESLint rules that you get out of the box with NX that can just validate that, oh, these two feature modules, they're not allowed to reference each other. These two feature libraries, they're not allowed to reference each other. Or this NgRx domain library is not allowed to be referenced from, some utility library, for example. So you can control with rules, you can control the whole dependency flow in like a bulletproof manner, that can work on a very big, like I've seen like 50 developers working together, and it's bulletproof because it's automated. If you cannot automate it, this will mess up when 50 developers work together. Trust me.
100%. It's like really, you need so much discipline, and like basically you have to like hardcore review every single PR. It's not realistic. You need the automation, and that's why NX makes sense from single application, basically.
Totally.
Cool. Yeah. Very cool. All right, let's go back to the NgRx. The next one is to create perfect view selector, like view or view model for your container components. And I think we can also like relate it to another point, which is very related, which is embrace local selectors and actions specific to a given container component or interceptor or feature or whatever have you. So those two are related. So let's maybe paint like, again, like a bit context around it. So when we use schematics to create our state feature with the reducer, action, and selector file, we basically, all of those belong to that state slice, right? And this is usually all right, because I mean, we are managing the list of orders, for example, and then we have a selector which gives us this list of orders as an array. Maybe we need this kind of transformation if we are using the NgRx entity, so it's not object but an array. Maybe we have some selectors which give us some derived stuff like the total order value, where it adds up all the orders, stuff like that, right? And those selectors really belong to that state slice. But now let's say we have a container component to implement some more complex view, where we do not only need the order state, but we also need like the customer state and like, I don't know, some process state and whatever have you, right? So, and then like the maybe first intuition would be like, okay, I imported and injected the store into my container component, and now I can basically define 3 streams: this store, select all the products, orders, whatever, and then select all the customers and select all the tasks. And I have 3 of those streams. And then maybe I would need to unwrap all 3 of those streams in the template with the nested ng containers. Or maybe I would do even something like combine latest in the component TypeScript logic, where I would combine all these 3 streams to get some view model. But again, if we relate it to that NgRx 80/20 rule, we do not want any logic in the components, because then we need to test that logic because an actual business logic, and we don't want to test components if not really necessary. So it is much better, in my view, to create, let's say if I'm in some feature, whatever, dashboard, and then I have a dashboard container component, and next to it, I can create a new dashboard container component selector.ts file, where I can import all those selectors and combine them, maybe even calculate some additional derived state which only belongs to that container component. And basically, then that container component will only inject that, or like the store, and import that single selector which belongs to it. And it will have only one stream called like view, for example, view dollar or view model, or however you like to call it, right? And then it unwraps it in a single ng container wrapper of the whole template, and then you are good to go, right? So your component has no business logic, perfect. If you want to test some logic which calculates some derived state, it's in the selector, the easiest and the fastest thing to test again, right? And another cool thing about this is like, as your state may evolve, you may need to alias some properties, right? Because they got renamed in the store, because they got renamed in the backend, or whatever have you. Then it's again easier to just change it in a selector compared to in a component in the template. So basically, you completely decoupled component template from the whole NgRx state management. And the only thing you guarantee is that that view selector will deliver perfect object to render in that component. And then to fix it, it's much easier to fix it in a selector than in the component, right? So you decouple it forever. So I think that's like hugely beneficial. And again, it's 2 things, right? So it's a perfect view selector for that container component. It's also local to that container component. Why would you put it somewhere else? Because it's not like the product state slice, it's not the customer state slice. You are combining as many state slices as you want to tailor the perfect view state for that component, right? And this can be also like, we did a similar thing, like we needed a perfect state for interceptor from multiple state slices. So we had the perfect interceptor selector, right? So it doesn't need to be only container components.
Yeah, I totally agree. We want to slim down the components as much as possible, just push out all the logic. And yeah, we can talk about facades later even, and of selectors, you know, wherever you want to keep a logic that, and then it's going to be presented the component. But yeah, component is ultimately for it's a presentation layer. So and it's hard to test on it. You don't really, it's a pain to unit test it if you want to test around edge cases and stuff. So it's way better to test directly on a pure function such as a selector.
So exactly, if you can end up in a selection when your component is literally like single view stream and then couple of click, submit, whatever have you handlers, amazing. And of course, there are like some caveats. So this is for the containers. Then usually what happens is like when you have a form, then I try to wrap it in like a form component, which kind of is then a bit messy because with reactive forms there is, or like I'm not aware of nice integration of NgRx and reactive forms. So I usually do like a manual bridging between that, or if I have a dependent fields that if like one drop down has to subfilter other drop down, stuff like that, right? So there are multiple ways about it. You can do it all in NgRx. You can just say like NgRx actually just delivers me the state, and then once it's in a form does everything for itself, and then I just, once it's finished, I deliver it back to NgRx. So there are multiple ways about that, but yeah, I mean, there will always be some components with some logic, but the less of them, the better.
Right.
All right. So then next one we can mention is that you should always name and implement your actions as events instead of commands. So this one is, I think, very well known in the NgRx like practicing community. There are also like quite some blog posts and talks and like video tutorials about this, but it still doesn't hurt to recapitulate it at least quickly. So this is also related to that fact that usually when we use NgRx, that we basically start by generating a state slice, which manages that state of the products, users, customers, whatever have you. And then you have the state slice, you have the reducers, you have the selectors, and you have the actions. And then like the first intuition is like, okay, I want to add an order. So I have add order action, or I want to, set order to a new status completed. So I have update order status, whatever have you, right? And this is a command. So then what tends to happen is we dispatch the same action from like multiple unrelated pieces of UI, and it works, that's all right. But you might be aware that we have something called like Redux DevTools, where we basically see the whole history of actions as they happen in our application. And then if you see there like, add order, you have no idea why it happened, like who added order, why the order was added. What if order can be added through 5 different flows? Maybe it's user on this page, maybe it's like through like some discount flow, maybe it's like from the event or like some whatever it have you, right? So there can be so many flows, and if you just call it add order, that information is lost. You have no idea what happened just by reading the action log. So compare that to situation where instead of single add order action, you end up having like 5 different actions. So for example, user added item to basket. For example, user applied promo code which adds him like additional bonus product into that order, whatever have you, right? So it just adds the order into the basket, whatever have you, right? And like the actions are relatively cheap, so you can create 5 of those actions. All of those actions will have a nice verbose description why it happened and where it was triggered. And then if you like come back to your application like in 3 weeks, or like you try to debug something in production and you see what happened, the way it happened, and then, oh, all right, like this makes no sense. Like I was doing this flow and then this happened, and like, no, this should not have happened. It should have been something else. It gives you a lot more information about what is going on and why. So you can debug the flows even without actually like looking into the code. So I think this is like a very powerful on that higher level to understand what is going on. And especially then also in the larger environments with like many developers and many libraries and projects, where it's just like not feasible to have a full understanding of the whole picture because it's just too much, right? So if this is done like rigorously, then it will help you to understand what's going on much faster compared to like add order triggered from 5 different unrelated pieces of like UI.
Yeah, it's interesting how the initial impulse, if you're not used to like working with reactive flow, is this you start thinking about like even like ISJS and NgRx as some, you try to map it with your imperative control flow as you maybe you're used to doing that. So you're gonna think as commands, but you have to turn it all the way around. You have to think about where it's actually being used, and then what kind of events should that subscribe to, and that could be multiple events usually. So a lot of beginners to NgRx, they think it's only allowed to have like one subscription, for an effect, or one subscription for reducer, but you can have many. You can have as many events as this particular event or reducer should react to, and that's going to make it more scalable in the long run, because you're not like hard coupling where the event is coming from and what it should do. It's all decoupled. What like the thing that's reacting to it's just reacting to some event, and the one that's doing something on the other end, clicking a form or something like that, they just like providing some like form submitted event somewhere, and they don't care about how that form submission is going to be handled, because it's going to be somewhere else. So you're going to decouple that whole thing. So ultimately you're going to make a better decoupling from something, for example, that happened in the view layer, and something, some reaction that should be happening in the domain layer. So all that is better decoupled. And that's going to help you when it all scales up, and maybe even different teams are going to handle that reaction when it's not completely tied like one-to-one. This command save new user, then you're implying what's going to happen. It's going to be more flexible later to do like different kinds of reactions to maybe the same event. Maybe the same event should trigger multiple effects. Maybe one effect should have like multiple subscriptions. All this become more flexible, without you need to rewriting it and doing it like very hard coupled. And like basically you're not using the reactive tool the right way. You're writing it as you're writing imperative functions, which when you might as well just write imperative functions doing HTTP calls when you click somewhere, and you're not using the framework correctly if you're not turning the other way around and just subscribing to different events, and just that the events flow around as needed.
Yeah, that's like a very big one actually, which I see people struggle often. Like the first step should always be to really make sure that we learn how to use the tool properly before trying to like work around the tool. So that's usually like a very good idea to really make sure that you familiarize. I cannot say that.
Familiarize.
Exactly. I can't say that's the one where I cannot pronounce with the tool before like trying to like improve the tool or work around the tool. Another thing which you mentioned, which is very cool, tying to that point, is that it's not just in the dev tools, but as you said, it's totally fine to trigger reducer or effect with multiple actions. So it's not just in the action history in the dev tools where you see what happens, but also by reading the source code, it gives you much more feedback when you read that reducer, that you actually know which parts of the application can actually trigger that reducer, because you see the list of actions from their sources. So that's actually another added benefit. So not just the debugging in the dev tools, but also just like when implementing stuff, you get like a very explicit list of how and from where this is triggered. So this is also very valuable. Definitely. So, but as you said, like it takes some time to get used to it, because of course the intuition is, I want this to happen, so I call this, so I command this, but sometimes it's better to flip it around.
Another telltale sign that you might be using command instead of events is, for example, if your effect is producing more than one action, that might also be a sign that you're actually firing a bunch of commands instead of just one particular action produced out of that effect. Ideally, you just only want to produce one. You want to take in. You can take in a bunch of actions, but you want to only return one action after the logic's been processed in the event.
Exactly,
because it's just one, a bunch of events coming in and then one event coming out after that.
Because something happened, right? This effect ran and something happened. So right. And you can describe what happened, and that's the next event, which can again trigger whatever have you. Maybe one thing to add to that, like one thing means like one thing at a time. So you can have an effect which dispatches 5 different actions based on what happened, but it will only be one of those 5 at one time, right? So it can be very typical example like success or failure, and anything in between, like different types of success, whatever have you. So it can be more than one, but like one for one result, one action, not multiple.
Yeah. Another common pattern with effects is that might, I agree with this like 99% of the time. This makes total sense. Use events and follow these guidelines here. But if, for example, you do like some cache checking mechanism for like, you have like an effect, the first step does a cache checking mechanism. Look, is this data in the cache, or should we do a request? And then the follow-up request, sometimes I would do that as a command, because that will always just be like the next effect I want to trigger. And it will actually make it like more confusing if I try to I could rename it stuff like cache check fail or something like that. That would also make sense. You could probably do that, but it wouldn't be the worst thing in that case to do a command. But yeah, for the most cases, just follow, like, write it as events. That's what scales. That's what's going to follow the reactive data flow that you ultimately want when you're using like a Redux tool like NgRx.
Makes sense. But yeah, I mean, like, no rule is like set in stone. Of course, you can always find like some exceptions to the rule where it just makes sense to do it the other way around. Nobody argues with that. But yeah, like, probably will be on the safer side if you try to follow it as often as possible. And then, of course, if you have some special conditions, or if it's like irrelevant because it's like very straightforward, it's literally like the next effect in the chain, but on the next line after that initial one.
Right. People probably know what you mean, right? You just want to trigger that. And yeah, it's a bit imperative. Yeah, it is. But maybe you want imperative that you don't want it to be like this event being thrown up in there when you just want to trigger the thing in the next line,
Exactly.
so that actually make it, I think, more readable if the command, the action is named what is going to be triggered in the next line. I think that's more readable than I look at this and, oh, what does it do? It can trigger something on, on some other file somewhere in the solution, and this makes it more clear that, oh, we are triggering the next line. So in that case, yeah, command triggering the next line after the cache check, not the worst thing.
And that could be also maybe cool, like, once you, I mean, there is also like NgRx lint rules, right? Like for ESLint. And there, for example, you have this, that you have a lint rule which forces you to specify origin. So it like follows more that event pattern, but it still doesn't really validate if it's an event. It's just that the action has like the name with 2 parts, the origin and the description, but that description could still have been command. There is no like language processing to make sure it's an event. But what could be related to what you just said, like if you and your team like want to create either like a custom lint rule or like some taxonomy of the action, so you can then have these 2 groups, like the events are the ones which can be handled also outside, and then the commands are like the private ones which are not supposed to be handled outside. So you could come up with something like this, which can be valuable distinction, which provides you additional information just like by reading the code of what is supposed to happen, right? So you could come up with such a taxonomy for your project, that you have like commands and events, but not accidentally, but like on purpose. And then the commands are only handled internally, and the events are for the public consumption by other state slices, for example.
Yeah, I definitely think that makes sense.
That's a cool possibility to extend it. All right. So the next one up, it's conveniently, effects are for orchestration only. So to make sure the actual logic is in services to keep the effect clean. So this probably is also obvious to most people, but what sometimes tends to happen is, as people start writing effects, like it ends up, well, what ends up happening is that there is actual like business logic in the effect. So instead of service, right? So usually you do not want that. You want to have the actual like business logic in the services, and then effects are there to orchestrate that. So if this happened, then please maybe perform request with this service, and then maybe transform the whatever have you, right, with the other service, right? So, but you do not really want to end up with an actual business logic in the effect. So this is, I think, something which anyway most people are intuitively doing anyway, because they're used to extracting logic from components into services. But just to like keep in mind that you do not really want to have like actual logic in the effect, but in the service instead, and then the effect is for the orchestration. This also means that then the testing of the effects again becomes simpler, because then the effect is tested only in that manner that did I call the service with the correct payload under correct circumstances. But
so you would just do that as a unit test, but only the effect being the real implementation being tested.
Yes, so I would mock out all the other services and just validate if they were called appropriately. So I would not have any logic in the service, which in the effect, which I think anyway, it's something which most people do already. So if I have, let's say, a product state slice and like the most simple effect, like load all the products. So I have, like, for example, event was that the product page was initialized, and now I want to switch map that into like loading of all the products. And I would not use the HTTP client directly. I would wrap this in like product service or product integration service or product API service or whatever have you, which maybe then wraps around that backend request, maybe also has like some transform response methods, all this kind of stuff. So then effect doesn't know about anything of that. Effect just then can be tested like, did I call that service like with the correct ID to load the correct product or whatever have you, or not tested at all if it's like really trivial. Like
it's going to be very close to implementation details at that point. So depends on like the testing approach.
So again, you want to not have tests where it's complicated. So you don't want to have testing components, and from the NgRx, the only complicated thing is effects. So preferably the less actual logic is in effect, the less you have to test it. If those effects are very straightforward, like the customer form saved event triggers like update on a customer, like what do you want to test there, right?
Yeah, that's interesting, because normally when people are learning NgRx and it comes to testing, then they learn how to test effects, and they're like, oh, now I need to learn these marbles.
Well, sure, like,
and then they're like, oh shit, I need to learn all these. It's like this new language to specify streams. Yeah,
extremely cool, because then you have like a really orchestration effects, which we had, for example, like a real life case. Basically, we have a logic which every hour checked, like made a request to the backend to check if there was a new version of the application deployed. And if yes, then it would schedule application request on the next navigation, or if the user was inactive for longer than 5 minutes. And that's something which, like, that's very perfect use case for effect. And that's also something which is like orchestration heavy and not really like logic heavy. And that's like a perfect case to test with those marbles, because marbles allow you to test these synchronously, even though you can let the test run for 10 hours.
Right.
So you can literally write a test which it thinks it runs for 10 hours, but actually it happens synchronously, and you get like very robust testing of that actual behavior without the need to change your production logic to allow you to override those timeouts from hours to like 10 milliseconds to do it with set timeouts, like after 100 milliseconds, then this, after 200 milliseconds, then this. You can leave it like, you don't have to change your production code. It's really 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever. And it will still run synchronously with those hours, which you can then literally specify the marbles. After 60 minutes, I expect an event with this payload. So this is really amazing. And that goes very well in the direction that, yes, effects are for orchestration. And for that, they are very robust. But like, of course, you only want that because that shouldn't and cannot be anywhere else, and it will be suboptimal if it would be anywhere else. But all the actual logic for like a request and transformations, you then still want to have in services, so you don't actually need to test those effects which do only like trivial things.
Right. Yeah.
Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I agree. And yeah, it simplifies stuff a lot, just putting into the services.
And you can really, like, another cool example I have, like with non-trivial flow, which usually those are caused not because it's something special. It's usually caused like by suboptimal API design, where you kind of have to work around like not the greatest APIs in the backend. So you end up like with strange streams. So, but then it kind of gives you opportunity to explore like more advanced streams and like orchestration. So imagine the case where you have to translate like business code, so not just like the languages, but like some business codes. And the problem with those is that it's like 300 mega of them. Don't ask me why. It's just a lot for like a huge domain. So
300 what? Sorry.
You have like 300 mega of business codes which you translate. So you cannot really have like a business code JSON which you load at the startup, right? So it's just too much. You cannot really put it like in IndexedDB. It's too big for any of those solutions, right? So then what happens is like you need to load them dynamically, but then you kind of try to make it somewhat performant. So let's say you have like a special custom translation pipe which translates those business codes, and now you navigate to a page, and then like maybe initially there are like 3 pipes with 3 codes, but then as you load the data, you load some entities which have another codes, and maybe like in like first 500 milliseconds, the codes keep coming and coming and coming, right? So you also don't want to do like 50 or 60 backend requests to get every code individually. So then the API kind of allows you to retrieve translations for the list of code you specify. But then again, like let's say it happens in a burst. It happens in like first 200 milliseconds when you navigate to a new page. You come to page, you get some because it's the layout. Then as the entities from backend come, you start rendering those, you get some more, right? So let's say it's like a burst of 200 milliseconds. So then that was like a very cool effect, which basically when the first request comes, it opens like a buffering window till some timeout and like forbids everything else until this first one was closed, but actually nothing happens if no requests are coming. And that was like the complexity, because if it would be happening on schedule or something like that, you have operators for that, like buffer time and audit time and whatever, or just buffer like every 10, but it's not like that. It's the first one and then timeout. And I don't actually even remember, it was something with the exhaust map into the stream of itself, but yeah, so that's the kind of like then crazier orchestration, which you really are then very happy that you have marbles. And you can actually really test those like explicitly to 1 millisecond. So the like, yeah, it's a bit hardcore to learn, but then you can get like a robust test coverage of this kind of logic, which is pretty business critical.
Right.
All right. So 2 more to go, and then we get to your stuff, which also looks very interesting. So the last 2 are actually very short. So one thing, like the effects can be triggered by any RxJS stream. So again, if you use schematics to generate your state feature, you will get your first effect stub, which listens to the stream of actions. And mostly like effects are usually triggered by the stream of actions, because that's what makes sense. When we submitted the update form, we want to perform the effect to update the customer in the backend, whatever have you. But it's not only the stream of actions which can trigger effect, it can be in fact any stream. So why could that be? For example, let's say we want to upload logs from front end periodically to backend every minute. It's a side effect, so why not handle it in a side effect? So our side effect can be triggered by the RxJS stream from the interval operator, right? So every minute, please run this effect, collect all the logs from wherever, or please upload the logs which were collected in the custom logger or something like that, right? Another cool effect can be, which is triggered not by the action but by something else, can be like basically listening to the debounced or throttled stream of scroll events, or especially like end of page scroll events, which can then trigger loading of another page of data. So that's also can be like a very nice effect, right? Which can be done very generic, because you can have like some scroll service, so you abstract it away, which just exposes you a stream that whenever user scrolled to the end of the page, you will get an event. And this goes again to that like actions as the events. We can listen to that in many state slices whenever we want to trigger anything which should happen once we reach the end of the page. So that event is very generic. it doesn't really care how it will be processed. So that's exactly what you said, that it pays then the dividends later down the line, that all is very reusable and decoupled. But yeah, the key point here is like it's normal and common that your effects are going to be triggered also by other streams, not just the stream of actions. Do you have some other like examples? Nothing comes to my mind right now.
Events from the router, maybe. That would also be some common thing. Like you want to scroll to the top, for example, when the router changes, something like that. That is a common one.
Yeah, that's a very good one. Yeah, like on the navigation end or something like this.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's cool. Yeah, cool. Now the last one is get comfortable using Redux DevTools and prevent potential performance issues as your application state grows. So this has two parts. So we already mentioned like the Redux DevTools, which is basically an extension which you can install in your browser. Nowadays, most browsers are Chromium based, so it will be probably from the Google Web Store, but maybe there are also like some other solutions for some other older browsers, but hopefully we can all forget about that past soon enough. And we already mentioned that like it has some very cool features like the basically application state history in that action log. So you see like as actions as they happened through the time. And it gets much cooler than that, because whenever you click on some action, you can actually see the diff of what that action like not perform, but like this action of course triggered some reducers, and then you can see the diff in the store which was caused by that action as it triggered all the reducers, right? So this is like an extremely powerful insight into what is happening in your application. Also, you can basically, whenever you click on an action in that list, you are at that point of time and you can see the snapshot of the state in your store at that time. So that's also very powerful to like just explore, like, does this state make sense? Like, is this inconsistent? And do I have some bug or something like that, right? And you can even like step through it like with like arrows to like go one after the other and stuff like that. It's really, really cool. But as your application state grows, of course, like it can show you these cool things because it remembers that state. And if your state gets big, this can lead to like a really big performance issues, right? So for example, it happened to me, like I was working on one SaaS product, which helps you to manage like large enterprise polyrepo environments called Omniboard, where I ended up in a situation when for like a larger tenants, I could have maybe 3 mega of state in my store, which was not a problem during the runtime, but for the DevTools, where for every action, this state was basically duplicated and stored for like last 20 steps, then 3 times 20, like 60. So then it gets problematic, right? And there comes into play like a possibility that NgRx allows you to write state and action sanitizers. And those are mostly meant to basically clean up sensitive content from your state, but can be also used to reduce the amount of state. So the cleanup of the state doesn't need to be just the sensitive content. It can be that if I have an array of 1,500 items, that I only for the like debugging purposes in the Redux DevTools, I only store 5 of those, and the other ones I throw away. And of course, it will limit my debugging capabilities, of course, but it's better to have some than to have none, right?
Yeah. I remember for a bank once, I was doing some GDPR stuff for cleaning up a lot of properties in the store that was not allowed to be there. And yeah, that's where it comes handy to write these state sanitizers. But yeah, it's quite annoying sometimes because it's harder to debug. You cannot see the specific value, and if it's that specific value, like a person ID or something like that caused the issue, then you kind of screwed. So you want to find this middle ground. Sometimes you can maybe save it somewhere else that is more safe. Or you can encrypt it somewhere, and you can do some stuff like that. So in the end, if you want to troubleshoot it, somebody has the key and can decrypt it. In the end, that's kind of what we end up doing with the logs, because we were like offloading the store to the logs. So every time an error would occur in this banking app, we would like take the whole store and like take a snapshot of that, so we can see the exact store, and we could like get the app back to the state it was in. And then some of the data was like had to be encrypted and or stored somewhere else, but like had another data policy, but allowed to store, for example, person IDs, like confidential. So we had to be sneaky about that. But we can do something like that, extract something away, and then we get it out of the store, and then we can like offload it to somewhere else where it's allowed to be stored.
Now that's actually really cool, like to hear like a real life example how this was used like on that level.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, what was the performance of such a solution? Because like it literally like encrypted state after every action?
No, we were like bulking up. So this is when we did the logs. We would do like logs on events and logs on errors in the system. So like on each error, we would send a log message, and then we would do all the process. We would do the process as we would offload. We send the log message, or we would wait. We will do like a debounce of like after 10 seconds. We'll take all the logs that being included after 10 seconds. So if it just happened like in a banking app, you don't need like crazy. There's no crazy animations that this can conflict with. So every 10 seconds, we just like every 10 seconds we're gonna flush all the NgRx actions, and so we have like a trail of all the actions. We have the state snapshot. We're gonna do all that every 10 seconds if there's any new events coming in. So yeah, we found some interval that worked for us.
Yeah, sounds good. It's like it's really cool like to hear about these other kind of use cases which I never encountered, because then it kind of gives you like another tool like for the future, right?
Yeah, because you only hear about it from the industry. You need to like be working at a bank or working at some specific place in the industry.
And there needs to be a requirement for that. Exactly.
You're not gonna learn it from like blog posts or from Angular books. This is the real stuff from the industry.
That's true. So definitely that. And if your stages get out of hand in terms of side, you can still just reduce it to like allow it to be still like manageable when you open your DevTools, that it doesn't like grind to halt. And yeah, you sacrifice some of the data, but at least you have other stuff. So yeah, you will find your own individual trade-off for your own individual case. Cool.
Right, so cool.
All from all these 10 points from the article. So I think we can then also probably share the link. I can then let you like for like in the video in the comments.
Yeah, it's gonna turn into a blog post on my blog, so that I can post. You can just post all the links and stuff. I'll post it. Yeah, I have some other best practices we can talk about. Some of them is something we already touched upon in your 10 best practices. But I think it's important, and you see it basically every NgRx project, especially as it scales. You have to like ask yourself these things. So the first thing is, do you want to have like normalization, have like one source of truth, or do you want to allow for some duplication of the state? Because I've seen projects going on both sides, and my personal experience is you get so many bugs and problems when you want to try to duplicate. In the beginning, it seems the best way, because you can simplify some stuff. You can do like the request at the backend, get all the data from the backend, save it, directly, not even do any much processing, and you just do some like request response stuff like that. Maybe like 3 different places in the app, and then you duplicate it straight from the backend, 3 places. That's fine to begin with, but once like you start to in the app start to like interact with the data, like you rename stuff in the app, and of course that also another best practice is normally you do like optimistic updates, because it gives like the snappy user experience. So that means you update the store before you update to the backend, and it's not the 90s anymore. So we don't wait for the app to update from a server response. So we update the cache. So if you have like 3 duplications, then you have to like make sure all of this is synchronized 3 different places. And yeah, you can say, oh, you just write some action and then subscribe to it, and 3 different places, and then you synchronize it, and then yes, so you have to write synchronization logic 3 different places for 3 different feature libraries.
Grows exponentially.
Yeah, and then you want to make sure like each of the feature teams, if they have like separate feature teams, they know that this should be kept in sync. And how are they gonna like coordinate that? In theory, it just never works, and it's just it's gonna be like the number 1 source of problems. I realized it's gonna have so many bugs once if you don't normalize and keep like the state in one place. That's my going from like one extreme, but like 3-4 duplications, and then we rewrote the app. We just had like one single source of truth. using NgRx entity. We started like normalizing all the data. Not only did our performance improve because we could just like do like direct lookups from the entities, and we couldn't do like direct updates of one specific entities without like you need to update in like multiple places. But also, like, most importantly, it simplified our design, which should be like the number one goal from like before you start thinking about performance and anything else. You just want the simple design. You know, that's what's going to work because that it's faster to implement and it works.
I'm 100% like on the same page with regards to this topic. Like I see like this preventing or removal of pre-existing state duplication as like one of the or the main like feature or like the idea of the NgRx, because at the heart of the NgRx is like a single global store, right? Like one for the whole application, which serves as a single source of truth. So that's kind of like the whole point, right? Because usually what happens, even like before NgRx, people have application, then they have state like all around the components and services. Over time, there will be some overlap of the state or like a duplication, maybe of the whole parts or even just the subparts. And then of course, they start writing synchronization logic. And of course, people will like, it's very hard to make it perfect, like to make it from every side. And like, I mean, even if you did it perfectly, it's still like a lot of code you have to maintain and which can go wrong, right? But yeah, like why I'm speaking about this like day, because I actually see that in practice, like with one feature in that enterprise, which was very like cross-cutting. And there was exactly that situation where the state was probably like in 4 services, and part of it was of course duplicated, and there was like synchronization logic, but like, you know, it grows exponentially, like it's 4 on power 2 or whatever, right? So it's so easy to forget some of the lines between them, like as it grows, right? So it has to be perfect all the time. So then there was like an infinite backlog of inconsistent state, hard to reproduce bugs, until the day it was rewritten with not actually NgRx, because at that time it was not possible for various reasons, but by Storm NgRx like pattern, which should have been then eventually migrated to NgRx, right? And since then there was not such a bug, like because there is just one state, so whoever updates it in that one place through like the centralized interface, right?
That was all the bugs we had were synchronization bugs. Before that, it's
yeah,
it was always that like testers would come back like, oh, when I do this, then I will go to this page, it's not synchronized. Oh shit. And then you write up some new synchronization logic, and it's just like endless synchronization logic. You do nothing but writing synchronization logic and fixing bugs,
which sometimes
which means
maybe people like that in the enterprise, they have something to do. Like I get also that part. Probably it's unintended. I don't want to like I don't. Well, of course, no, it's unintended, but like, yeah, there is a better way. Now, like if we apply this to when you already do have NgRx in your project, it's still like having NgRx doesn't mean that you will never duplicate your state. You still have to be very careful and like pay a lot of attention, because like, yeah, that you use NgRx doesn't mean you will not have the same properties or same object multiple times in your store, right? So definitely you want to keep an eye on that. You do not want to create like state slices which manage exactly the same state. But what is even like more insidious is like, if we go with this very classical example, we have a list of orders, and then we want to add them up to see like the total order value when we add all the partial order values, right? And what could happen is that people will do this in a reducer and store it in their store, but this is a derived state. So even though it's not really like a direct application, it's not like I have order A twice, I could, like, it's a still duplication of the state, because I could have figured out that number from that list of orders. It's a derived state, so I would still need to synchronize it. Whenever I change the order, I would need to recalculate that. And for that reason, there is like this one very strong rule in NgRx, where whenever we need to do derived state, we always want to do it in the selector, and we never want to store it in a store, because derived state is a form of state duplication which with extra steps, but has suffers from exactly the same problems as we described with the services. It's just like it looks slightly different, but if it grows, it will lead to exactly the same problems, where you forget to synchronize it in one of the reducers and you end up at the same place.
Also, you can have like different bounded context in like a big application where like a similar domain object, like an account, for example, let's say in a banking setup, like account can mean different things. Let's say you have an investment account and an account in, let's say, a transaction account. Then like they both have an ID, they both have a name, and they both have like I don't know, like account holder ideas, stuff like that. But they have us, they ultimately gonna like derive in different directions. So in that case, there can be some state duplications, but it's two different things. Like domain wise, it's not the same thing. Like investment account is not the same as, you know, as a transaction account. So you have to like also look at where it's, what direction it's going, because initially, even if it was like 100% the same thing initially, you had to be like, oh, it's actually two different domains, maybe in two different bounded contexts. So probably should split it up and allow for some, it's duplicated initially, but it will grow in different directions. So we want to account for that. So it's almost like if things like domain wise are the same thing, then you shouldn't duplicate it. That will be stupid because you could just have one thing. But if it's domain wise, it's going to drive in two different directions, then you're going to save yourself some pain down the road if you start initially by splitting it up. So you had to like think about domain driven design. You had to think about what they mean from a domain perspective. Is it the same thing? Or is it actually just looking like the same thing initially, but it's going to grow in different directions because they have different users, different use cases. It's domain wise a different thing. So I think that's like, that's when it's allowed to duplicate. And then we can talk about like performance optimization and stuff like that, where you can run into problems with selectors. And I was thinking about both you and me, like we have I work on some SaaS projects as well, like for myself. So we get to choose like our own tools for these projects. And I've been playing around with like using like NgRx for my own projects and other tools like Akita. I don't know if you played around with other like more lightweight state management frameworks. And what's your opinion on like when should you introduce NgRx? I guess there's some listeners here that might not be using NgRx, but I heard about it and like considering if they should go and implement NgRx at work tomorrow.
Yeah. So like for me, there are probably two things which are like the main things when I think about it. It's how big the application is, like how much state, and then usually application has multiple features. As we discussed previously, those features are probably isolated from one another in the forms of lazy loaded features, lazy loaded modules. So for me, it boils down to like how big is the state and how isolated that state is. So I can give you like an example from opposite ends of the spectrum. So we had like this one application for search in that enterprise customer, which had like literally like 13 different searches, like sub search applications for various domain business objects, right? And as it turned out, all those searches were completely independent from one another. So in that case, even though the application was relatively large, had a relatively lot of state, because that state was completely isolated from each other, we even went with something as simple as having like a result list property on the component. Because even though it was relatively large, many features, many views, the use case and the flow itself was trivial. It's literally, I populate the form, I click the search, I get the results, and I link away. So like you don't even need to extract it to service because it's so trivial. There is nothing to really test again. Like, I mean, you could, right? But if it depends, right? So if it's that trivial, then even the component can be enough, right? And then you can go like with the NgRx component store, but like why? You just click on search and you get the list, and like nothing else can happen. All you need to do is like to block a button for like this while the request is in flight. But again, it's trivial and it doesn't interact with anything inside of that application. Those could have been separate application like in themselves, right? That there is no interaction whatsoever. So yeah, that's like a one end of the spectrum where it's like maybe big, but it's so isolated that it doesn't really matter. So then yeah, you go with your components, with your services, not a big deal. But then you can have something small like a one pager with like a single feature with a complex flow which gets the push from WebSocket because there is like some task list, whatever, and the interaction itself and the orchestration is complex of what can happen at what time, and maybe you do some drag and drop sorting on the tasks and whatever, and it gets complicated, and probably want to have some tool or like which helps you to achieve that in some maintainable way, which is not just like some crazy tangle of streams, right? So what I try to paint here is that size can be a good predictor, but also may not be a good predictor, right? So it's probably like the complexity of the logic and how much of the state is reused in like different parts of application. I think those are the things which I look at the most. That's like for introduction of the state management library itself. And then once I think I need to introduce the management library, then from the ones which I explore, which is NgRx, NgXS, and Akita, I like NgRx the most. NgXS is almost the same, but they actually do not have like a first class support for effects. So as far as I understand, or like some time ago at least, was the case was that you could inject the stream of action in your service to make something like effect, but you also had to manage like your subscription state, and like that you pretend that the effect as a concept is not there doesn't make it go away. So the side effect as a concept is there when you want to do something periodically, when you do want to do something on scroll or navigation, as we discussed, right?
Maybe some would say if you compare them, like there's less boilerplate in the other options like Akita, and a lot of people say, it's nice. Now there's like less boilerplate because it's less reactive. That's basically what it is. Like it's Akita is more it's, I think would say it's more command wise. You have these set state stuff, you know, it's a less reactive flow compared to NgRx, but it's like, and then people compare, it's too much boilerplate around it to create, you know, all the, you need the action creators in place, you need the reducer, you need the effect, all this stuff. And yeah, that it's schematic done. Yeah.
And
yeah.
even next thing, which actually we forgot, and you have a GitHub Copilot, and GitHub Copilot with NgRx, there's like a match.
That is sick. That is matching heaven. That is sick. I used to get up Copilot as well. Yeah, it's crazy.
Like, so because it's repeated patterns, then Copilot contextually will do perfect stuff for you. Like it's insane. It's insane.
It's
like
gonna write all the boilerplate.
Really, no, it's like, I mean, hands-on, like it's insane how good this is, like with the proper NgRx. But yeah, back to Akita. The way I understand Akita, I never really played with it too much, is that it's optimized for like a simple CRUD, which fair enough.
It's a lot like, you know, like in React you have like set state and stuff. It's a lot more imperative the way you set state. So you have like you have the store, and then the store is going to have like a method called set state, for example. So it's going to be more like the command, the actions, and the reducer is like combined into one thing. Just the store is where you also like trigger the so all the you don't have a like reactive event flow in Akita. It's more like it's just an imperative, more imperative store, I would say. But like
I have a to-do page which has a to-do state slice with the to-do form, then it works well. But once I start to reuse it across some complicated flows in the application, then maybe it's not so.
I think if you need so the way you read in Akita, that's reactive, but the way you write, it's imperative. And I think if you need both ways to be reactive, as you maybe need in a big enterprise setup, that's when NgRx comes handy. And then there's also the features. Do we want synchronization with local storage, session storage, all this stuff? Do we want like router state to be synchronized in the store? All these extra features, that's also consideration. And then there's like the future of the framework. Are you going to bet your money on something you might change later? And yeah, that's like the consideration of like what our developers skilled at. And as right now, NgRx is the industry standard
By far
for.
the most used, by
It is
far.
the most common. It is the official Redux implementation for Angular. So yeah, it's what most, if you hire in like especially in a new Angular consultant, he probably knows about NgRx. He might not know about Akita, but yeah, for my own project, I try to compare them. For my own like smaller projects, I actually prefer Akita because it's just less code and it's faster. And I don't need my writes to be reactive. I don't need to fire up some event that all feature teams can handle. So I see that would be the case if I was working with more different feature teams, but I don't. So I don't need the write to be reactive, but it's nice. I still want my reads to be reactive. I still want that. I think it's important in any Angular application because you still want to, it's a web app. There's stuff coming from the backend. There's a lot of asynchronous stuff happening, and you want to like always keep it in an observable stream. You want to, yeah. So that is still important, and that is still satisfied with Akita. But no, the question is, do I want the write to be reactive?
What about like then let's say like a very common requirement which basically I think like necessitates reactive writes, and side effect is like deep linking, right? So you do something and you want to reflect that state into URL. Also, then of course you want to like read it when you navigate somewhere, like deep linking or exactly these kind of things which we describe, like whenever you like these effect-based things, whenever you want to do something on some interval or like as a result of some event on scrolling and stuff like that. I actually have no idea like in Akita if this is handled nicely or not.
Well, I don't think that normally you will just do it as normal XDS in that sense. I'm not really sure.
Support for that, you have to then like just do it like vanilla RxJS.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then there's also the other approach, where you don't use any framework and you use vanilla like XDS state services, which is behavior subject, which is fine sometimes initially.
Works, yeah, but like as the stuff grows, it like the standardization pace of more and more as the stuff grows. But yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Let's do the last one. Let's do the pre-compute. I like that one. And
yeah. Let's talk about that. So we talked about before that we should keep all the logic out of the component into the view projection with the selectors.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a fundamental principle. You want to keep the components simple, both for testability and for separation of concerns sake. But sometimes I had this case where I had to bend that rule a little bit because I had this account page in a banking app with all these transactions, and you could do stuff like that. You could rename, you could like flag transactions and do stuff like that, interaction with it, which ultimately would like update one of the transactions, and they were all getting generated from the selector. And that was fine when it was just like 100 transactions, but you could like keep loading. You can scroll down. So you could load like 1,000 transactions, and to compute these selections, you had to like update the balance. The balance was like being accumulated from each transaction. So there were some computations going on. So as you kept scrolling, it was like an infinite scroll page on the banking app. So at some point, things would just be too slow. So every time you do any interaction with the transaction, the recompute that happened in the selector just got so slow because it had to recompute the whole list. I was using NgRx entity, and that's not going to save you here because
it does optimize reads, but you still read the whole list and
you read the whole list every time, and you just like edit one thing, it will still like update the whole list. Yeah. So yeah, what we ended up doing was that we added an enrichment property, I think you can call it, on that particular transaction object. So for example, stuff like the balance, I would like all this stuff I was calculating before in the selector. I started to like just calculate, as it was necessary. As it got loaded from the backend, I calculated everything. As any transaction was, any interaction was going on that updated that particular transaction, I updated just that in the store. So I had this, in a way, it's data duplication. I mean, it's something that could be calculated that you can say I cached it in the store, basically, for performance reason. And that solved the performance problem. Now we could have like thousands because I only updated the selector got super simple. It basically, it just like, it had all the all the heavy computation was like already pre-cached in the store. So it just rendered like an array in a list of like, you know, like a virtual scroll list. So that fixed like performance problems in that case. But yeah, you talk about another way. Maybe you can even handle it with selectors without, you know, needing to add enrichment properties in the store.
I mean, like, obviously what you described is, you are 100% right, that like there are always some cases where the happy path will just not cut it anymore because it's just too much, of course. And what you described also works. So of course, like the most important thing is to deliver the working solution. So 100% on that. Of course, like as we discussed previously in that other section.
No, also, the derived data here was not being used any other place. So data duplication was not really a problem with synchronization. Exactly. All that. It was not a problem.
Exactly. So then the only risk there could be still that once the amount of reducer handlers which manipulate that part of the state slice increases, and maybe like 3 months down the line, and the new developer team who takes over the project may forget whatever. So there I would still maybe try to go more in a direction of making like impure selector, which is a bit more stateful, which is maybe some caching mechanism or something like that, where you maybe just check if there was like a new ID in the list of IDs, and if, or something like that, like these sub values, like just do basically the same as was done in the store, but on the level of selector, because that's the place where people in general would expect it to be in the future, let's say, for the people, right. If, you know, as people come and go. So of course, sometimes you need this. I think there I would try to somehow make it work in the selector with some additional state, which, I mean, you can come up with like some map, big map, whatever, or whatever have you, like make some keys. That's probably like the only thing, if I really zoomed out. And
it might be a little harder to troubleshoot because you cannot use DevTools anymore, and so it might be a little harder to, like, if the cache, you know, got wrong.
It's a trade-off.
It's a trade-off for sure.
100%. So like, just from that very zoomed out perspective, it may be, if you think about like project over years and people changing, then this could be helpful. But as we established in the beginning, it works and it was necessary. And that's most important thing.
Right. It's like the principle you want to follow, like the 10, for example, the 10 best practices you talked about before. You want to follow them until, for example, you run into performance problems, until you need to optimize stuff. That's when you start make a trade-off of design and optimizing, for example, performance. Exactly. That's when, because you don't want to do it early on. You don't want to fuck up your design because you think maybe you're going to have performance problems later on. That's not how it works, because the holy grail of, you know, good development is keeping the design as clean as possible. That should be your number one goal, because when your design is clean, you're going to have less bugs, you're going to have faster development, you're going to have better user experience and developer experience in general, and then you can start, you know, then things can start to get more shitty as you run into problems, which you will do in the real world. There'll be like platform problems, there'll be all kind of stuff, that browser incompatibilities, there'll be all kind of stuff, and, you know, gonna make you start messing with stuff. And but until that happens, you can just focus on the best practices.
Exactly. No, that's I mean, you can leave there a comment, right? Like, just pay attention, careful, like this has to be in sync, whatever. Like, there are like stuff happens. That's all right. Yeah.
Right. I have another interesting question. What state do you put into the store?
Right. That's a good one. So in general, I differentiate between like the entity state slices, which are more related to the API endpoints, and then like view state slices, which are more related to like view interaction on particular page or container component. It often happens that they start like merged into one when I create a new feature, and then it manages one entity plus some view state in terms of like filters, sorting, search, whatever have you. Then maybe if I need to reuse the data, I split them into like the view state slice for that feature, and then the entity state slice for that entity type, like product.
So you put all the state in the store, all the state, like presentation state.
So but I try, like, if this, so whenever the state is deep linkable, which I try to make also like the filtering, selection and stuff like that, then I put it in the store. If I have some state which is not really deep linkable, then I don't put it in the store. So in general, like for user experience, I try to make whatever state makes sense to make like deep linkable, so that users can send links to their friends or colleagues, which pre-fills the filter form so they can see exactly the same thing as their colleague. And that state kind of has to be in store. Well, it doesn't really need to be in store, but that would not make sense that I have two different systems to solve the same thing. So of course I put it in the store. But then if there is some other kind of state, so for example, if the expander with some details was expanded, I will usually not reflect this into URL. So then this will be probably like a state inside of the view component, which is like reusable generic view component expander. This will not go into the store. So that's my heuristics. Like for me, like in 2022, like I consider like deep linkability of most of the application state to be very user friendly or expected. Again, depends on the type of application. I can very well imagine that this doesn't make sense for some type of applications, right? But like for standard enterprise CRUDs, where there are some flows to get into specific step of the flow, or to like be able to see that pre-filtered view which colleague prepared or something like that, and that's all very strongly related to like a deep linkability. And then if it's deep linked, if it's reflected to the URL, then it's for me also like in the store. In terms of forms, again, depends on the particular requirement, but what I prefer, if it's fulfilling like the idea of the customer enough, what I prefer to do is to basically have a state in NgRx store, but once I give it to the form component which receives it through input, I stop synchronizing until the form was finished in one way or another, either submit or save draft.
Yeah.
So then it's like I give it to form, and then form,
because it's temporary, right?
Yeah,
It's
and
temporary process.
only synchronize it back into NgRx after some user interaction. I mean, if you click on save draft, or save draft happens every 500 milliseconds or 500 milliseconds after last keystroke, is not really a difference, right? It's not much of a difference, right? So, but the point is not every keystroke. So it's a submit or save draft if it's explicit save draft, or if it's like every 10 seconds save draft, or if it's 5 seconds after stop typing save draft. That doesn't really change that it's a save draft.
Right.
So give it to form and then receive it, but like not every keystroke. I don't like to have it like that. Yeah.
Right. I've been trying both extremes of putting like everything, also presentation state in the store, like very local state, or even like very temporary state, like form state in the store. And then I tried to like take a step back and be like, hey, what is the real store actually for? And maybe there's a more pragmatic way, because it comes with a price every time, you put state in the store. You have to go through the whole boilerplate stuff.
Too much is too much, right?
Yeah.
Or then you just create crazy generic action like update state, and that also.
So the general rules we end up setting up for that particular project was like global state was that we put global state in the real store, and then we put state that had to use some of the NgRx features, such that it had to be synced, for example, with the URL, like for the deep linking example, or we had to maybe sync it with the session storage, or local storage, or we had to sync it with offload like some logs to the logs on errors, stuff like that. So we had to hook into that whole flow. But for a lot of other stuff, we started actually not using NgRx for that, like the very local stuff. Forms is a good example. Forms we didn't handle with NgRx anymore, because it was too temporary and too component specific. So if something was only used on one specific component, then you can use something like NgRx component store, for example. That's another option. You still can have the reactive flow. You can have a bit less boilerplate, and that's fine. I think you don't necessarily have to sync it with the Redux dev tools and have it in the global store. I think you can accomplish what you want to accomplish in a simpler way in that case. And then you have, for example, the global store, where you want to put stuff that should maybe be accessed by other parts of the application. It should be like globally available, and maybe you need to access some of the NgRx features. So that's like my point on what should go in the store. So, and after this, like I saw the efficiency like it become way faster to implement features when not everything had to go in the store. It's like saying, for example, write 100% unit test, even in the application. There's also something like I used to do that, but then I was like thinking about, it actually doesn't make sense. Like, for example, when I tested my actions, I'm basically just rewriting the implementation logic. So it's giving me very little bang for the buck in that case. So it's something like that where we had to like just use common sense and be like, yeah, and I know, because some of this stuff used to be like best practices around, in the industry, but you had to think about it. And now I think we're coming more to like this golden middle ground. We could be coming to sense. People are like, oh, you don't like, testing used to be like, back in 2016 and 17, like everybody was doing like TDD with Angular and writing 100% unit test, and everyone was putting like all the NgRx state in the store. These extremes that comes, out of not finding like the golden middle ground, because it's always there's a middle ground between things, especially when you try it out in the industry and you're gonna be like, oh, maybe you don't need to put everything in the NgRx store. Maybe you don't need to write unit tests for everything. Maybe there's stuff that's more important and more valuable to put in the store than other things. So yeah, global stuff and stuff that needs to use the NgRx features. I have one last topic we can talk about. So that is another interesting thing that kind of splits the waters in the industry. That is to use facades or not when with NgRx. Yeah, against. Yeah, I can hear you against totally.
I'm against, but again, like, is it absolute? No. So for me, like, it all boils down to like how those facades are done. So, like, I mean, like, I kind of do it in that way that like this perfect view selector for container component, right? That's almost something in that direction, but let's just say when I use like a tool like Angular or NgRx, then like I think now it's like also that the industry got so mature that those tools are pretty great. So then I try to think about them that they are already the right level of abstraction, right? So then I try to solve it on that level. Okay, so instead of having a facade, I just create another selector which combines the selector. So I don't need this extra level. I can get the same on that same level using it like one less concept to achieve the same. I mean, so, but if you really want to have it like a service which you inject, which then exposes you a selector stream, like, and if it has like methods which wrap store dispatch and the specific action like name, so that the component only injects one service instead of like 5 actions to dispatch on clicks. Sure. I mean, sure. As long as you don't start implementing parts of NgRx logic in that service. If you really make it so light, like really just a facade, and then you still do everything correctly inside of NgRx, from my point of view, like, feel free. But then kind of that service also loses the point. But if you start to implement part of the logic in the facade instead of NgRx, then I'm like, why? Then I don't like it. Then I don't like it.
Yeah, I think like the argument for using a facade normally is there's a bunch of different arguments, and like if you look at like the normal like software development, how we've been using it, like we had the like different layers, and like the domain layers was like extracted from the view layer in like server-side application, for example. So it's kind of like you can draw the same parallel to front-end development. Like, why don't we do the same thing? And then that's when the facade will come into play, because it's so common, like
what it will do in practice, right?
Backend world.
What can it do? Like, okay, I have a facade which combines selectors for me, then that should have been selector anyway, so it's easier to
but sometimes maybe you don't have NgRx for everything in the facade. Maybe you have a mix, like some from it might be like more like component store state, like you have like some local state for the component you don't want to put in. Maybe you have like some form state, for example, you don't want to put down in NgRx. So you don't necessarily use NgRx for everything, right? So if you did, then it would be no problem. Then NgRx would be a facade. But the thing is, you don't, right? You might not put everything in Redux. That's so yeah. And that sense, I think facade makes sense, and especially when you start out and you're not sure about like what kind of state management you're going to go with, then also
like
facade,
okay,
it's going to give you some flexibility as well. Instead of just pick something, because as soon as you're like a couple months in with NGRx, you're never going to get rid of NGRx again.
This part, like if you don't have NgRx, then it's basically just extracting state logic into service, which makes perfect sense. And that like the state logic implementation switches behind the scenes from like behavior subject to NgRx. Sure, but like I just never saw really like a value once you have NgRx like from start. Like what does the facade actually then do?
Especially if you put everything in NgRx. But if you do like a mixed approach where you have some as it is like component store and some as NgRx, you have like this mix, then and I think it starts to make more sense.
Sure, then you have to, then that's like a bridging logic between two worlds, right?
Yeah, it's just an abstraction of that, abstracts the state management away from your view layer with this facade. I think that would make sense in like a lot of software development.
Only thing there still I would like to point out, which is very important, is like if you have a facade, as long as it like dispatches actions or like calls stuff on component store, that's like okay. It's just because before NgRx, when you have a component and this component calls some function which returns a stream, and then you have to subscribe and do stuff, right? So, and then like just the one very huge feature of NgRx and FX especially is that I call it like it allows you to handle function calls together, because it's a stream of actions. So you can cancel previous one, you can debounce, you can throttle, whatever you want to do. But once you have a facade, once you have a service, once you have just a method call, if that method call doesn't just like dispatch action which you can then handle together, but then start doing some reactive logic, then you again run into that risk that you lose the ability to handle functions together. So you cannot buffer, cancel, throttle, and this kind of stuff.
Right.
So it's like one thing to keep in mind to like, it's adaptive to start like writing stream logic.
You can still do it like that, but another argument like against the facade is that it's going to be more command based naturally when you have a facade, because it's a method you invoke, but you can still like name the method as some event if you want.
Yeah, but it's more about what it does behind the scenes, right? So if it really actually dispatches some action, so then it's okay. But
right, like, it would exactly.
If a typo had search through facade, you need the ability to cancel previous queries, because you can get out of sync responses on the UI. So you still have to emit some actions else or some other way to handle them together to be able to cancel. If you just start doing normal streams, or like just not normal, like function call, just like, because when you call function and then you call another function and then you call another function, those are totally independent from each other. There is no easy way to cancel previous one if it's a function call, which does the stuff. So that's like one thing which we could have mentioned, like about NgRx itself, like part of the genius is that because it's action based, like this is built in that you can always do this handling together. That means cancel, throttle, debounce, buffer, which you don't need always, but often you do. Or just wait for first one to finish until the next one can start in terms of updates and stuff like that, right?
You mean in the effects, for example? You mean handle this in the effects stream?
So whenever you need to orchestrate the stream of actions, and you need to be able to handle them together, which function calls inherently are not. The risk with the facade that you might introduce this logic which will make it very hard to do that when you need to do that. NgRx, it will always just works.
You're more inclined to make more imperative programming than following the NgRx reactive flow. I agree on that, but I think you can get both things working, and it gives some flexibility. I mean, I've been working on a project that does both extremes, like full NgRx projects and facade projects. For my own projects, I personally use facade because I normally go with like also more lightweight state management solutions. So it's sometimes I will use like a behavior subject for handling state and mix it with NgRx, stuff like that. And also because I like to offload like all the logic away from the component into the service. So I need the service anyways for that. So for stuff like that, I think it makes sense. But if you're already using NgRx everywhere, I wouldn't rewrite the whole thing to be to be facade. So
good point.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think that wraps up like all the best practices. Thank you very much, Tomas.
Thank you
It's
very
great
much.
talking to you.
It was really great. I think we went pretty deep. Like we really went through the whole thing and like a lot of experience from the practice also from your side. I like really enjoy that, like to hear those like banking examples. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, all the best with your projects.
Thank you. And how can people get to know you more? And is there anything else like you got any? You also got some courses you sell and other stuff coming up.
Right. So yeah, as we mentioned in the beginning, like if you want to reach out at Tomas Trajan on Twitter or AngularExperts.io, in general, we are like offering Angular consulting services. If you are just starting up in your company, you want somebody who creates like a robust architecture, stuff like that for the applications themselves, for monorepos, for component libraries, icon libraries, whatever have you, we are there for you. Besides that, we have an offering of like workshops related to the topic. So that's like Angular mastery, getting reactive with RxJS, and Angular state management with NgRx. You can find it on the website AngularExperts.io. So yeah, if you are interested. And last but not least, if you are working in a large enterprise polyrepo environment with hundreds of, or like let's say more than 50 of projects, we have created a SaaS solution called Omniboard, which allows you to define like ad hoc checks, regex and xpath and JSON path base, which you can then run against your repositories. And then you can visualize them using custom dashboard widgets. It's very generic. So basically, I heard like people describe it as like a living cloud-based lint tool for migration. So basically, if you have something like you want to have an overview of your environment, which application uses which version of the library, or which applications use some in-house library and which APIs from that in-house library, so that you know that you finally can actually delete that deprecated thing because nobody really uses it anymore and stuff like that, then this can be interesting for you. And I think that's it.
All right. Thank you, man. Take care.
Thank you. Until next time. Ciao.
Ciao.